Greetings, traveler. Have you ever tried to design items for your game or tabletop RPG game and so on, and you find yourself lost as to what the new items should be, what abilities they should contain, and ultimately what purpose they would serve for the player? I certainly have found myself in this situation earlier on in my career, and today what I want to do is share how this situation usually forms up, how we find ourselves in this situation, share what approaches I explored trying to deal with this, and finally I want to share the three types of items that generally exist and how finding out what those types are helped me in my approach in designing these items ever since, and ultimately made designing items for video games and games in general basically effortless. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 14 years now, and I remember when I started designing upgrades and items for the current airship game I'm working on, I was thinking, what sort of items should there be available in the game? What would be something that the players want? What would be interesting, and so on. And I found myself, if I didn't focus on it enough, to basically start to copy items I saw in other games. So an item that would have so and so parameters, and something that would be as good as something I saw in another game. And long story short, all the ideas I came up with were just derivative from other games, and there was no consistency in the items I was developing. It would be something that would have some power upgrade options, and it would look better than the previous item, and it would offer some better quality of life and so on, but that just made it difficult for me to decide how many of these items there should be and what interesting decision or choice would that offer for the player inside the game. So what I did instead of just going with this method was go back and look at all the items in games I liked or games I had seen before. And basically, I saw that there's these three categories of item upgrades or items in general that I noticed in games. So one of them was items that offer more power. So if we're talking about, a battle game with, for example, swords and so on, sword fighting, then a new sword would have more attack power, let's say, than the old sword. That's a reason for the player to want to switch to that item. The second category was utility or quality of life upgrades. So this item doesn't necessarily offer more power to the player, but it lets the player do the things he's doing always in fewer steps, or it allows the player to do something he couldn't do before, but without necessarily offering more power. To give an example of that, let's say that for the quality of life type of upgrade, let's say for the player to be able to go back to his base, it would take, 1 minute or 4 actions, like going through portals and so on, to go back to the base. But with this one item, it either takes much less, it takes half a minute, for example, or instead of it taking 4 actions, 4 jumps between portals to go back to the base, now the player can do it in 1 jump, for example. That would be a quality of life upgrade. For utility, something that fits well into this category is allowing the player to do something he wasn't capable of doing before. For example, let's say that the player is having a hard time detecting enemies because of obstacles in the environment, enemies are behind walls or something like that. This item would allow the enemy to detect enemies through walls, for example, or it would show a pointer on the screen saying that the next enemy you're looking for is in that direction. So there's a little arrow on the screen pointing at the next enemy. That doesn't automatically make the player more powerful. When the player attacks, he still attacks with the same attack power, but it helps in navigating the game, and it makes the task of, in this case, finding enemies a little bit easier, without necessarily making the battle against these enemies any easier. So The last category of upgrades is of course the visual one. So this can be just related to the appearance of the player or the player's vehicle, and it might also be coupled with one of the other categories. So if the player gets a new sword, for example, it might be more powerful and it might look cooler than the previous sword. But simply looking different or simply looking like something new or having better visuals is an update by itself. And we see this often in the player's outfit, clothes, livery on cars or vehicles and so on, badges or different hats and so on. There's tons of items in this category. And why do I think it's important to set it apart from the others and make it a category of its own? Well, because as you probably have experienced in many games, things simply looking different makes a big difference, right? So if your character is wearing no hat, for example, and then puts on a captain's tricone, that might just look better. Or if for example your weapon looks really boring and you switch to this new weapon that has flames, or it's dripping icicles, or it has this like magic aura or whatever, even if it's exactly the same attack power than the previous item, it just looks better and there's no reason not to switch to that. So basically putting these three categories together gave me a good direction, a good method to pick what new items should offer to the player. So this switched my perspective from trying to think of items that generally sound good and maybe have a mixture of all these three categories in them, to being purposeful about what sort of upgrade option do we want to offer to the player. So putting that in practice in my game, that made me think, okay, so the player starts from this level at the beginning of the game, and by the end of the game he's supposed to get to this level power-wise and look-wise and all that. So what are the steps necessary to get from the start of the game appearance and power level to the end of the game? And creating these three lanes, so power-wise, utility-wise, and looks-wise, create a very easy to understand, very easy to design upgrade step methodology, I suppose, to not only design the new items, but to also place them in the game. I would know that, for example, by the first third of the game, it would be good for the player to have, let's say, achieve 30% of his total power, for example. Or if I know that there should be 10 visual upgrades from the beginning to the end of the game, then I could distribute them at every, let's say, 10% of the game progress-wise. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be like strict and mathematical like that. Of course, the final product will have a bit more randomness and a bit more purposeful distribution. But the important shift here was going away from items that just sound cool to thinking about the utility to the player at the moment the item is introduced. So this is helpful because you can make meaningful comparisons like this. When you introduce an item that's mainly offering more power to the player, you can examine at the other power options at that timing of the game. So if you offer let's say 20% power upgrade type of item 40% of the way in a game, you know what other options are available to the player, and you as a designer can make an informed decision of whether this would be interesting for the player or no. To give a counter example, if an item only offers 1% more power, but it's offered immediately after the previous upgrade, then the player might not be interested in pursuing it. Now, the same 1% item, if it's offered right before the ending of the game or right before the final boss, then that is a more interesting option, because it's like communicating to the player, would you like to fight the boss in your current state, or would you really try to take the time to absolutely maximize how much power you have by the time you get to the boss? Again, it's not a forced choice upon the player, it's just an option that the player has. And there it takes the meaning of, do you want to do everything in your power to improve your character before the boss, or do you feel confident in your current build, basically? And the interesting thing here is that both of these options feel good to the player. Whether the player says, you know what, I feel pretty strong as I am, let's go fight this. That's a good realization for the player to make. It makes him feel good about his efforts so far. And if the player says, you know what, I really want to max out everything, let's go for that extra 1%, then that also feels good, because it reaffirms to the player that he's the kind of person who gets every advantage, puts in the extra work, believes that every bit of effort is rewarded, and so on. So for the player who chooses his option, it also feels good to go with this. And even though in both cases we're just talking about a 1% difference in power, it feels completely different to the player depending on the timing where we put it on. Anyway, that's it for my thoughts for those three categories of item upgrades. So items that offer more power, items that offer more utility, and items that offer better looks. And just as a final little bonus note, it is very possible to combine all of these upgrades into one item. So one item that has more power and more utility and looks better than items that came before it. Of course, that's possible. Many items in games offer that, but it has the downside of being a little bit too good. So if every other item in the game only has more power or more utility or better looks, and suddenly this item has all three, it just overshadows everything. So unless this is the final ultimate weapon of the game, and once you get it, you don't go back to anything else, it will make the player hold on to this item for a very long time in the game. And if he has this item that has all three, and an item comes along that has only a little bit more utility, for example, then the player is forced to skip it, because yes, this new item has a little bit more utility, but the item that has all three is just better overall. So all the extra work you put into coming up with this new more utility item basically is wasted, because very, very few players would switch over to that over the item that has all three aspects. So that's an interesting food for thought there. Anyway, that's it for items for today. I hope, traveler, that this enlightens your way when you're thinking about items, and it helps you move away from simply copying items or copying design choices from other games, and helps you reason a little bit better and design a little bit easier how these items exist in your game, and how what sort of options there are when you're designing these. And it hopefully makes the design process a bit more fun for you. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have fun.